Dear friends, thank you for joining me for my sixth and final podcast in the series, A Virtual Journey in the Footsteps of Jesus. And today we're going to reconstruct the events that we celebrate on Good Friday, the Passion of the Christ. So let us pick up where we left off during the last podcast, which is at the Last Supper. This is the Seder meal on the eve of Passover that Jesus and his apostles, as observant Jews, would have celebrated in Jerusalem, since they were prevented from going back to Bethany, where they were staying with Mary and Martha. And of course, we all know this beautiful painting by Leonardo da Vinci. I've done some research on this work and even produced a film about it. And while it's a beautiful and very well-known work of art, Leonardo made one little mistake, and Mel Gibson made the same mistake in his film, The Passion of the Christ, which is that both in the motion picture and in this painting, bread is depicted as a fully risen loaf. And as the evangelists tell us, this was the beginning of the week of unleavened bread, when Jews ate bread that had not had an opportunity to rise in the oven, celebrating that moment during the Exodus when the Israelites were told by Moses to leave their homes to go on the route to the Promised Land. And so they had no time to wait for the bread to rise. Ever since Passover and the week of unleavened bread is a time when Jews eat bread that is unleavened. Therefore, very hard cracker type bread, which is known as matzos. And that's still celebrated to this day. So Leonardo may not have known that. Mel Gibson definitely did. So it's a bit surprising that we see Jesus and the apostles eating from a sliced bread in that movie, but that's a small detail. The Last Supper probably took place in this hall. Now, you would be surprised to find that this is a Gothic chapel. And the reason is that this site was revered as the place of the Last Supper, almost from the 4th century onwards, when Christianity became a tolerated religion in the Roman Empire. And the mother of Constantine the Great, Queen Helena, went to the Holy Land to identify places associated with the Passion of Christ. And this is one of the places that were identified as such. Later on, the Franciscans took it over. The Franciscans are the guardians of most Holy Land places in Israel today. And in the 14th century, they rebuilt it as a Gothic chapel. That's why you see these pointed arches that are obviously not of the period. From the Last Supper, then, we are told that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives to pray. And this is a very peaceful picture. I've been there many times, and I've been looking for a wonderful shot that I could use in the book, in the footsteps. And this is one of those pictures that you see in the book. You see the beautiful olive trees. You see Jerusalem, the walls in the distance. Of course, instead of the Dome of the Rock that we see today, we would have seen the Second Temple right in that spot. However, I should add that while this is typically depicted as a garden, here, for example, you see that beautiful painting by Mantegna, The Agony in the Garden, when Jesus prays to his Father and asks him to please let this cup of great passion pass him by, but he adds, I will do your will. And you see that all the apostles are sleeping. They have fallen asleep after this long and busy night, busy day rather. And you can see in the distance that the temple guards are already arriving to arrest Jesus. This is a very beautiful painting by Mantegna, but the fact is that Gethsemane actually means Gethsemane, which means oil press. And what we can deduce from that is that Gethsemane wasn't necessarily a garden. In fact, the Gospels do not identify it as a garden. That is just a later interpretation. But we do know that oil presses were typically located in a cave in order to keep a constant temperature, particularly in the hot months, which is very, very important for the production of olive oil from olive presses. So Gethsemane was probably not a garden, but a cave. And there are several caves on the Mount of Olives. And in fact, a wonderful pilgrim, Egeria, who traveled to the Holy Land. She's a woman, and she traveled by herself to the Holy Land in the 4th century. And she wrote in her diary, which was a big hit, a big bestseller in that time. She identified a cave just like that and said, this is the cave that has traditionally been identified as the location of Gethsemane. And here is that cave. So some of you may have actually seen it on your visits to the Holy Land. It's still used today for small services, as you can see. And then, of course, is the moment when Judas appears on the scene. Judas Iscariot, the only disciple of the 12 apostles who came from Judea. Iscariot is a village in Judea, which is interesting. You know, all of the other disciples hailed from Galilee, but Judas is the only one who comes from Judea, and you kind of wonder if that plays a role in the reason why he decided to betray Jesus. And there are many reasons why he decided to do so. But what's so interesting is that the Gospels make it very clear that when Judas reports Jesus to the chief priests after the call for his arrest goes out, and he collects his 30 pieces of silver for his betrayal, the temple guards right away say, but you're going to have to point him out to us. And this proves what I said a few podcasts ago, that during Passover, when the city of Jerusalem, 50,000, would be overwhelmed with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, that obviously the vast majority of those pilgrims could not stay in Jerusalem itself. They only had a limited capacity. And naturally, during festivals, these prices were very, very high, so that the vast majority of pilgrims who had come to Jerusalem for Passover would be sleeping on the Mount of Olives. That was the only plausible place where they could find a quiet spot. So that whole mountain, in view of the temple at night, would have been teeming with people, of families, with children running back and forth, screaming, and people lighting campfires, women cooking. You can imagine what it was like. And so the reason why the temple guard said, but you're going to have to point him out to us, is because how were they going to find Jesus amongst these thousands and thousands of pilgrims who were camping out on that ground? And that's exactly what happened. So, and that's the purpose of the kiss. The kiss was, and that's a very traditional greeting for a disciple in antiquity. When you came to your teacher in the morning to get a class, then you kissed your teacher, not something that we would do today. But that was very common. And so it's very ironic that Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss, which is typically a sign of great devotion, as, of course, the beginning of his passion. And now it's interesting that the Gospels clearly say that it was the temple guards who are sent by the chief priests to arrest Jesus. We're not talking about the militia. We're not talking about the Roman soldiers, which clearly shows again that, as I argued in my previous podcast, that the reason why Jesus was arrested, the reason why the warrant for his arrest went out, is because of the disturbance in the temple, because that fell under the purview of the chief priests, and particularly the high priest Caiaphas. They were authorized to arrest people if it pertained to any religious trespass. And now, what happens next is extremely surprising and totally out of precedent for cases such as this. Throughout the first century, we hear of people who are tried or arrested because they disturbed the peace or they disturbed the sanctity of the temple, including the apostles, by the way. And whenever that happens, people, suspects, are taken to a public prison. That's exactly how the book of Acts of the Apostles refers to a public prison near the temple. They are placed in the prison and there to wait for a full hearing by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. And clearly, during Passover, there was no way you could convene the full Sanhedrin, 72 people. There's no way, because these people were obviously at home celebrating the eve of Passover. So, and you see that's exactly what happens when Peter, John, and other apostles are arrested. This is after the crucifixion and resurrection. They continue to spread the word, the good news, and they're arrested repeatedly. And you see that same cycle. They're put in prison, the Sanhedrin is convened, and their case is heard. And the reason is, again, that when it comes to a religious crime, a religious felony, only the full quorum of the 72-member Sanhedrin would be required. You would need to have a full quorum. That's to protect a certain sense of religious freedom and the ability of people to state their case. So that sense of protection was definitely part of that tradition. Now, I refer here to the Mishnah, which is a 3rd or 4th century collection of the oral law, a series of debates about the application of the Torah. And there is definitely debate among scholars whether that the Mishnah, the descriptions of the Mishnah, had applicability in the 1st century, so about 3 centuries earlier. I do believe that's the case, because the power of the Sanhedrin to adjudicate religious crimes was enshrined in its very body. And in fact, that tradition goes back to the Hasmonean era. So the 1st century BC, even during the reign of Kingdom the Great, Herod the Great, who, of course, was very much in control of that kingdom. He always deferred to the Sanhedrin when it's about matters of religious trespassing. So the Sanhedrin was typically, they met in this part of the temple called the Stoa. And of course, they didn't do this on a daily basis. So you had to wait for an opportunity for your case to be heard. By contrast, any criminal cases, political crimes particularly, such as rebellion or sedition, now that, yes, that was typically to preserve the Roman authorities, or in the case of Herod, the king himself. But when it came to religious matters, religious felonies, that was the call for the Sanhedrin. Now, a very important thing to remember is, as we saw in the previous podcast, that the Sadducees had a majority on the Sanhedrin, and clearly Caiaphas and the chief priests were Sadducees, but that the Pharisees still had a minority, and a very vocal one. And at every turn, they tried to give the Sadducees a very hard time. You know, we could see that same process happening in our Congress, you know, how the two parties sort of jockey for power. And what is so interesting is that I believe that many Pharisees were in sympathy with Jesus. They respected him as a rabbi, and they sought his opinion. Now, it's interesting that the Gospels depict the debates between the Pharisees and Jesus as sort of antagonists, you know, like they come to test Jesus. But actually, that's what they did. The Pharisees amongst themselves came together and often fiercely debated the application of the law. So that the idea that they would go and seek out Jesus and ask him tough questions was not to entrap him necessarily, but because they valued his opinion. They wanted to hear what he had to say about these issues, such as purity and sanctity and marriage customs and so forth, because they themselves debated those issues on an ongoing basis. And so I believe that, that many Pharisees, if they had been in attendance on an indictment for the full Sanhedrin of Jesus, they would have perhaps come out in defense of Jesus, as they did in the case of Peter. In the trial in front of the Sanhedrin of Peter, Simon Peter, it was a Pharisee, Rabbi Gamaliel, who stood up and defended Peter and actually got him off. So that clearly shows that, in my opinion at least, that Caiaphas feared that if he waited with Jesus until the full Sanhedrin had a chance to come together, that Jesus might very well be released. And so we see something truly unprecedented taking place. What we see is that Caiaphas moves the indictment of Jesus not to the temple, not to the prison, not to the Sanhedrin, but to his home, to his private home. That's very bizarre. And what he does is then he collects a group of hand-picked people, from the chief priests, all Sadducees, of course, no Pharisees, to make sure that Jesus was in fact going to be found guilty. And the reason, again, as we saw in my previous podcast, is because of Jesus's accusation in the temple: "You have made this temple a den of thieves." Now, he was quoting from Jeremiah, but it struck home because just before, as we saw, Caiaphas was indeed accused of being a thief together with Pilate, because he planned to use the funds of the temple treasury for something that had nothing to do with the temple, namely the construction of an aqueduct. And so Mark clearly says it. They put together a very select group of people and put them in the home of Caiaphas. And this is how Caiaphas then hoped to get Jesus indicted. Now, this was pretty much all hypothesis when, in the late 1960s, Israeli archaeologists actually uncovered one of those mansions that the Gospels talk about. Very exciting discovery. And, it had a courtyard, as you can see here, and it had mikvaot. These are these private pools, which a pious and affluent Jew would have to cleanse himself, to purify himself. And also what you see, and I'm going to go to the next slide here, it had a large reception hall. Do you see that? It had a large reception hall. And so clearly this would have been big enough for a group of, say, 30, 35 people at most, to actually sit in judgment of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that this is the mansion where Caiaphas presided over the indictment. What I'm saying is that this is a very good illustration of what such a priestly mansion could have looked like, because clearly this looks very much like an illustration of the setting that the evangelists are talking about. Today, you can visit that mansion in the Wall Archaeological Museum, which is one of the few museums in Jerusalem that are not part of the official archaeological authority. It's a private museum, so entrance times are sometimes a little bit erratic, but it is definitely a very interesting place to visit, and you can really visit the homes in Jerusalem of the time of roughly of the 1st century, before the Great Jewish War, because all of these homes were then destroyed during the Jewish War. Now, that's all good and well, but Caiaphas still had a problem. And the problem was that without a quorum, the full quorum of the Sanhedrin, he could not condemn Jesus to death. I mean, that was the flip side of the coin. Yeah, you can do this in secret in your own home and not have the Pharisees give you a hard time, but you could still not condemn him to death. For that, you needed the full quorum. And even then, you had to demonstrate that Jesus was a clear and present danger to the sanctity of the temple. So he came up with a very devious plan, dear friends. He said the only people at this point who can put Jesus to death are obviously the Romans, because the Romans still have reserve the right to condemn anyone who was accused of political crimes, not religious crimes. So his challenge was to massage the evidence to spin it in such a way that it would qualify as a case for the Roman authorities rather than the religious authorities. And so he engages in a very devious interrogation of Jesus. And he says, are you the Messiah? Was it true? You claim to be, the Messiah, the chosen one, and so forth. And then Jesus says, oh my God, Jesus says, and he quotes from the Psalms as well as the book of Daniel, which I believe is very, very important to the ministry of Jesus. He says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Well, in the Gospels, Caiaphas tears his clothes, but inside he is excited, he's delighted, because like the Romans don't know the Psalms, they don't know the book of Daniel, they don't know any of these texts. All they have to hear is, here's a guy who is a man who claims to come down with power. Obviously, that is seditious activity. And so it is with that piece of evidence that Caiaphas is delighted and is able to refer the case to Pilate, who happens to be in Jerusalem for Passover, obvious reasons. 2 years ago, big massacre. So Passover was always a time of great social and political tension. So Pilate would have been in Jerusalem anyway, and perfect. Let's refer Jesus to Pilate. That's exactly what happens. Now, as I said in my first podcast, Caiaphas is a historical figure. Some time ago, archaeologists found his ossuary, which is a box in which, after decomposition, the bones of a deceased are placed. And here it is, right here, inscribed in Aramaic, Caiapha, which is the Aramaic version of Caiaphas. Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. So then what happens next? And this is a topic of some controversy. One group of scholars believe that the so-called trial by Pilate took place in the fortress of Antonia, which you see right here. As we remember from previous pictures that I showed you, the Antonia fortress was built exactly for the purpose of maintaining the peace in the temple forecourt, which of course was a perfect place to create a demonstration, a political demonstration. And so this is where the Roman garrison would be, a small cohort, not really a legion, just a small garrison. So it makes sense that the trial would have been taking place in the Antonia fortress. However, a growing group of scholars, and I shifted to that group as well, believed that it would have taken place in Herod's palace. Herod built a sumptuous palace in Jerusalem for himself. And we all know that Pilate was someone who really liked luxury. And so it's unlikely that he would have chosen the Antonia fortress, which would have been a very Spartan place, very Spartan accommodations, and would more than likely be hanging out in Herod's palace for the duration of Passover, where there were beautiful swimming pools and gardens and entertainment and good kitchens and all that good stuff. And this map here is from my book, In the Footsteps, prepared by the wonderful team, the cartographic team of National Geographic, and I'm very, very grateful to them for creating this beautiful map. So, two choices. Either Jesus was tried by Pilate in the Antonia fortress, overlooking the temple, and if that's the case, then this would have been the place. This is a picture I took in a monastery of the Sisters of Zion at the beginning of the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. And many, well, traditionally, it was universally accepted that this is the location of the Antonia fortress. And the pavement that you see here, the pavement, is the pavement from that fortress, and that probably this is where Jesus was tried. Recent research now has suggested that it may not be the case, that this Roman pavement actually dates to the 2nd century, to a different time, which we will describe very, very shortly. So the other location, as I said, it's not the Antonia fortress, but here Herod's palace. And just as I was finishing writing the softcover edition of In the Footsteps of Jesus, it's now available in the softcover, I heard of a sensational discovery. I made my way to Jerusalem. I met the young Israeli archaeologist who made this discovery. And the fact is that for a long time, we've suspected that Herod's palace was right here in the place what is now called the Tower of David, the Citadel of David. It is a place of a beautiful museum. Some of you may have visited it. But this young archaeologist took me down the steps of a building which is located in that precinct. It was used in the Ottoman period, the Turkish period, as a prison of all places. And he took me down the stairway to this excavation right here, and he showed me Herodian ashlar stones. These are large stones, sculpted stones from the Herodian period. And based on that, he calculated that this is actually the place of Herod's palace. So if that's true, then this is the place where Jesus was tried and not the Antonia fortress. And now I'm inclined to agree with that as well. And then the trial takes place. Now, this is where we need to think a little bit about the proper historical context, because Matthew, Luke, and John, who wrote in the Roman Empire, outside of Roman Palestine, and because they lived in the Roman Empire, they were very familiar with Roman jurisdiction. And that was called the jus civile, the civil code. And as many of you know, Roman law was extremely well developed. Cicero, that great lawyer, used Roman law repeatedly to go after bad guys. And so it was a highly developed code and very fair in many, many ways. So Matthew, Luke, and John didn't really imagine that it could be any different. So they actually set their scene according to the jus civile. The problem is that Jesus was not a citizen. And the jus civile didn't apply to non-citizens. For colonials, which Jesus obviously was, an entirely different law applied, which is called the jus gentium, a very arbitrary system that gave wide latitude to whichever Roman official was presiding, because it was left up to that official to deem guilty or not guilty as he saw fit. It was originally developed in Rome for foreigners living on Roman soil during the Republican period. And then when the Roman Empire grew and grew and grew and became bigger and bigger and bigger, and all these territories now fell under Roman sway, the local official says, well, we need some sort of a legal system to adjudicate, problems. And they say, oh, just use the jus gentium, just leave it up to, the good judgment of whatever governor or prefect is in charge over there. And thus it is that I don't think the trial of Pilate was really a trial. It was more of a hearing. Jesus comes in, the accusation is read. Pilate asks, do you have anything to say? And when Jesus is silent, he says, okay, well, that's it. You're accused of sedition, of claiming to be a king, the Messiah, which I understand is the same as trying to, become the political head of this country. What did Pilate know? Obviously, the chief priest would have been whispering in his ear. And so I don't think that the trial was a real Roman trial. It was more or less a hearing. And you know what? That's exactly how Mark describes it. Mark, The earliest gospel, closest to the oral tradition, doesn't describe it as a full trial, as, for example, the Gospel of John does. He does it as a brief hearing, no more than 5 minutes. And of course, the verdict was always a foregone conclusion. And it's for this reason that when Paul was arrested, some 30 years later, the first thing that Paul says, oh no, no. I'm not going to be tried here in Judea, because he knows what that entails. He insists on being heard by a full Roman court. And since none was available at that time in Judea, he is therefore shipped at Roman cost. He is shipped to Rome to get a full trial. Of course, along the way, he has shipwrecks and all sorts of adventures. But it goes to show the extent to which the Romans would go to secure a fair trial for a citizen, a protection that was not available to non-citizens like Jesus. That's the sad story. And then, of course, then Jesus is scourged. The reason why he is scourged is not necessarily to inflict torture, although that was clearly part of the plan. You know, the apostles too were scourged as part of their punishment, but the principal reason was to accelerate death by crucifixion. Death by crucifixion, as we know from Roman records, such as the uprising of Spartacus, could take several days. If you were nailed to a cross, which is a very, very horrible procedure, it could take several days for a condemned man to die. Horrible death, but still, it was not done in a few hours. Now, the Roman authorities knew that given the Jewish sensibilities, certainly during Passover, you could not let a body on a cross after sundown. They didn't want to provoke an uprising. That was the whole point. And so that is why Jesus is scourged, not necessarily as an additional punishment, though that was definitely a factor, but to start blood loss, to start the loss of blood, so that by the time he was finally nailed to the cross, his death would be accelerated, as indeed happened, as we know. And so he would have been able to be buried by sundown, as the Gospels indeed indicate. Now, what is that Via Dolorosa, that road of sorrows that took Jesus to the cross, either from Herod's palace or the Antonia fortress? And here I always hate to say this, dear listeners, I always hate to say this, but we don't know. And I know when I go to Jerusalem a lot and I take groups along, and of course we follow the Via Dolorosa, but I always have to tell them, now, this is really what we imagine it would be, because Jerusalem was totally and utterly destroyed after the second Jewish rebellion of 133 to 135 AD. At that point, the emperor, in this case Hadrian, said, that's it. I have enough of these Jewish rebellions. You know what? I want you to go to Jerusalem. I want you to raze it to the ground. I mean, not one stone shall be on top of another. And that's what happens. So the Jerusalem we see today is actually a construct, a Roman construct of the 2nd century. And we no longer see the Jerusalem that Jesus knew. I know that's a terrible thing to imagine. That doesn't take away the reverential, the inspirational, the spiritual value of walking the Via Dolorosa. You know, don't get me wrong, I do it many times and I find it deeply inspirational, but from a historical point of view, we really don't know. In fact, what you see here, the main street in Old Jerusalem, leading from the Damascus Gate, some of you may have walked this. This is the Roman Cardo. Remember our visit to Sepphoris, the Roman Cardo, the main street? Here it is. So Old Jerusalem today is still we can still see the imprint of the Roman city that was built in the 2nd century by Emperor Hadrian. But one thing we do know, and that is, I think the tradition is very, very clear on that Jesus was crucified and buried at the place where today the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands. Now, this church was built and destroyed many times, first by the Persians, then by the Muslims. And so what we see here is largely a confection almost, multiple different buildings that date from the Crusader era. And that's why you see that the style is Romanesque. That's the style of the Crusaders, right? Early or Norman architecture, as the British refer to it. But this beautiful diagram that, once again, my friends at National Geographic created, shows you exactly what's going on. So there are two different buildings here. You can see each with their own dome. This is the place associated with Golgotha, the place where Jesus was crucified. And this is the place originally called the Rotunda, where Jesus is believed to have been buried. Here is that tomb, of which more in a moment. And so though both of those buildings, they were much bigger originally when they were built first by Queen Helena and subsequent architects. But today, I think we can still see the spirit of that original building. We can go down and see the bedrock that the evangelists talk about. The tomb was cut from bedrock. And all that is still very much visible. It's an incredibly moving experience to be there, even though I must tell you that whenever you go there, it's usually packed to the hilt, which makes it difficult to really reflect on the passion of Christ. When I took this picture, this is the place associated with Golgotha. I literally waited for 2 hours to find a moment when there wouldn't be any, you see somebody's already stepping into the frame, where I would just have a clean shot of this place. You can see the crucifixion is depicted there. So nevertheless, a very holy place, a very holy spot to reflect on the suffering and passion of Christ. And then, of course, we have that wonderful story of Joseph of Arimathea, who comes and asks Pilate for the body of Jesus, not something for the faint of heart, because you don't want to be associated with a political rebel. Now, what is so interesting, and I go back to what I started with earlier, that the Pharisees were in violent opposition to the Sadducees, and many Pharisees were actually in sympathy with what Jesus was trying to do with the kingdom of God. And you see that Joseph very clearly is a Pharisee, a member of the council, a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Gospels say, but he wasn't aware of what was going on behind his back. The Gospels are very, very explicit about that. And he was, of course, very disturbed and angry that Caiaphas had done this without the Pharisees knowing. And Joseph of Arimathea actually was also expectantly waiting for the kingdom of God. There you have it again, that important program of the kingdom of God that really was branded Jesus, was so important of his ministry. So Mark and even Matthew calls him a disciple. Can you imagine a Pharisee who's a disciple of Jesus? So there is no question in my mind that there were Pharisees who were, not all of them, but there are certain Pharisees who were quite intrigued by what Jesus was, and certainly would not have condemned him to death. No way, no way. And so it is Joseph, not the apostles, because they all fled, great heroes they are. They all fled when Jesus was arrested. And so it is up to a Pharisee called Joseph of Arimathea together with the women who stood by Jesus's cross to wrap Jesus's body in a linen cloth and put it in a tomb that he had ordered to be hewn from the rock. And here is that place. Here is that building that you see here is 19th century, but it was recently opened by members of the National Geographic and the authorities of the church. They opened the tomb. They looked inside. Not only was it empty, but more importantly, they could see the bedrock underneath the tomb. Incredible, isn't it? Incredible. Many times after I take groups to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I take them to this place, the Garden Tomb. For some time, it was believed that this could be the place where Jesus was interred, put in a tomb. I don't think many historians still believe that. It's now been proven, I think, fairly convincingly that it dates from the 2nd century or maybe 1st century BC. But what I like about it, it doesn't have the crowds, it doesn't have the busyness of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is a beautiful garden, lovingly maintained by, I think, a group of Lutherans. And I always go here because this is really where you can sit and reflect on that great suffering. And this, of course, is then the place of the resurrection, not this particular location, but this is where you can really imagine the resurrection. Now, the Gospels don't describe the resurrection, very interestingly, but they compensated for that, I think, by describing the transfiguration. And so you see in the Renaissance that artists such as here, Raphael, depicts the transfiguration so that we sort of have an idea, a visual idea of what that great resurrection could have looked like. I've come to the end of my story, but I want to leave you with one very important thought. And that is that the Gospels are unanimous in their description that the empty tomb was first witnessed by the women, by Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, whom we believe is Mary, the mother of Joseph, and Salome. We're not quite sure who that Salome is, but clearly these are 3 very courageous and brave women who remain with Jesus while all the apostles, all the men have fled. Even more importantly, John says that Mary Magdalene was the only person to witness the empty tomb. Now, you might say, okay, well, that's wonderful. What's so special about that? But what's so special about that is that in the Jewish court at the time, the word of a female eyewitness had very, very little credibility. According to the Talmud, in fact, a woman's testimony was in most circumstances inadmissible. So my last question to you is, why would the Gospels place a female eyewitness at the most important event of Christianity, the resurrection? And the answer can only be because that's exactly what happened. That's the only reason why the evangelists saw no way other than to respect the oral tradition that said a woman, Mary Magdalene, this very loyal follower, was there when she discovered the empty tomb. And I think that's a wonderful postscript to the ministry of Jesus and how he embraced both men and women as followers. And with that thought, I'm going to leave you. I hope you've enjoyed these podcasts. I hope I didn't stretch your attention for too long a time. And I wish you a wonderful Easter or any reflection on the footsteps of Jesus. Thank you so much.